the Weekly Mail from the 28th of November, 1908, reported the following, quote, "A detachment of the Malta Artillery is at the Custom House rendering assistance, and a staff of military and naval doctors is doing everything possible for the injured survivors who have been removed to the naval hospital at Valetta. The direct cause of the disaster cannot yet be stated, but it appears probable that it was due to an explosion."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Tragic Flames of the Sardinia.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Sardinia was a steel-hulled screw steamer of 1,514 tons. She had begun life in 1888 under the name of the Gulf of Corcovado, and would later be renamed the Paolo IV, before being purchased in 1902 by the Papaiani Ellerman Line. The Ellerman Line rechristened her the Sardinia. Under this name she would set sail from Liverpool, bound for Alexandria, with a crew of 38 under the command of Captain Littler. Captain Littler had 20 years of experience in total, and had been in command of the Sardinia for her past 2 voyages. On board, she also had 20 passengers who got on board in England, primarily traveling in first class, as well as a general cargo, the nature of which would later be of much debate. It was later published that it contained machine oil and gunpowder, but the company would wholeheartedly deny this. It was later said that at least part of what was on board was instead petroleum naphtha, stored in the forward hold. The idea that there was machine oil on board may have come from the fact that part of the cargo was also machinery that was bound for Alexandria. The Sardinia was also carrying a huge amount of coal as fuel as she departed from Liverpool, enough to reach Alexandria and then return to Malta, before she would need to acquire more. The Sardinia reached Malta with a stop in Tangier without incident. Some of the European passengers disembarked, while others came on board as the Sardinia departed from Malta. There were 14 European passengers on board, but they were no longer the only passengers on the Sardinia. They were now joined by 140 pilgrims on their way to Mecca. So many passengers could not all be housed in the accommodations on board the Sardinia, and shelters were erected on the deck to protect them from the sun and elements for what was expected to be a 4-day voyage. These were cramped conditions, but no worse than any number of other pilgrim ships that made the voyage every year. Indeed, having taken only 140 pilgrims on board was a relatively small number, and it can probably be attributed to the fact that Sardinia had holds full of general goods bound for Alexandria, and therefore they could not fit any more people on board even if they wanted to. Offering passage to people on Hajj was a booming business for many shipping companies in the region, and some ships made it their full-time trade, unlike the Sardinia, which was expected to return to Liverpool for more general goods. At 9:45 in the morning on November 25, 1908, the Sardinia began her departure from Valetta, Malta. The crew was still securing the anchor as the ship traveled outside of the harbor when there was a cry of fire. The people hearing the shout turned in that direction to see flames issuing from the ventilator on the port side, suggesting that the fire had already firmly taken hold without anyone noticing up until this point. A hose was immediately directed towards the flames, with the water pouring down into the ventilator, but it had little impact. Soon, the flames were issuing from other ventilators. It was estimated that within 10 minutes, the entirety of the amidships of the Sardinia had been completely enveloped in flames. There was never any definitive finding of what sparked the fire in the first place, though it was speculated that since the pilgrims cooked for themselves, it might have been a careless cooking fire. Considering the flammable nature of the cargo, however, it could have been any number of other things as well. No one seems to have witnessed the initial spark, at least no one who survived. The escape route for the entire crew was cut off, and the only 5 members of the engine crew who did reach the deck were those who were off duty at the time. Unfortunately for those on board of the Sardinia, they were not able to ground the ship immediately. The closest land to them was the location of the city's arsenal and magazine, and with the Sardinia in full blaze, it was too dangerous not only to the Sardinia, but to the city itself if they grounded in such a spot. Captain Littler turned his ship to try to beach her instead, beyond Point Ricasoli, further away but without the immediate danger of gunpowder close by. The order was given to abandon ship, but this quickly proved to be impossible. The boats had all been destroyed already by the fire. The fire on the Sardinia did not go unnoticed on the shore. People flocked to the harbor to watch in horror as the flames grew, while the British naval vessels that were stationed there sent out boats with sailors to offer aid. Admiralty tugs were dispatched to see if they could tow the ship to safety, and local fishermen set out to see if they could pull anyone from the water. All of their efforts were thwarted by the winds, choppy waves, and the flames that were now billowing from all sides of Sardinia. The passengers on the deck of the Sardinia screamed for help, but no one could reach them. The fishermen in the boats began to shout for the passengers to jump overboard, so they could be pulled from the water, but many of the passengers were women and children who could not swim and clung to one another terrified, but unable to bring themselves to throw themselves into the sea. Kate Gilmore, stewardess on the Sardinia, would later complain that the shouts for people to jump overboard had only added to the chaos on board, rather than offer any reassurance. Others disagreed and said that if the passengers had jumped overboard sooner, many more lives would have been saved. One person did almost immediately act on the suggestion to jump overboard, to the disgust of the rest of the crew. One of the chief cabin attendants grabbed a lifebelt and became the first person to jump overboard, leaving all of the passengers, as well as the rest of the crew, to fend for themselves. Fortunately, the rest of the crew was less inclined to abandon their posts, even though there were occasional explosions of flame, adding to the danger. Captain Littler and the other officers were driven from the steam steering gear on the bridge by the flames, but Captain Littler was undeterred and made his way to the emergency steering device at the stern of the vessel and continued to try to safely ground his ship. He remained at his post until one of the eruptions of flames engulfed him, and he was lost from sight from the others on the ship. Further explosions followed. The ship's hatches all blew off one by one, which was supposed to have claimed the lives of many of the victims. Everyone who had fled to the forward part of the ship was also all lost, except for those who could bring themselves to throw themselves into the water. Without anyone steering, and with the steering badly damaged, the Sardinia now added to the danger of the boats that were standing by to aid them by beginning to circle, making it even more impossible for any of them to get near her. The flames were now reaching up to 200 feet in the air. In total, she would circle 3 times before the flaming wreck stranded near Point Ricasoli at 11:15 in the morning. Captain Littler had not given his life in vain. The ship was now in a place where she would not endanger the rest of the harbor, but the boats that had been nearby could finally come near and pull people off. Captain Littler had not been the only member of the crew who had stood at their post and continued to do their duty the best that they could in spite of the growing fire on the Sardinia. All of the crew other than the chief cabin attendant, who had jumped ship, were praised for being calm and collected. Second Mate Watson and Stewardess Gilmore were both mentioned in particular as having done everything they could once the ship could be evacuated, to keep the passengers calm and help them leave the ship safely. As a woman and the only female member of the crew, Gilmore was encouraged to come down to safety in one of the waiting boats, but she refused. She prioritized ensuring that all of the surviving women and children who had been among the passengers had been evacuated first before she climbed down to one of the boats. All resources possible were mobilized on land to save lives. As people were brought to shore, many of them were burned, traumatized, and in some cases weak from the large amount of time spent in the water. Ambulances were waiting for them to carry them to the hospitals, where all available medical staff, including from the Navy ships in the harbor, were waiting to treat them. The local customs house was, meanwhile, turned into a makeshift morgue. The Navy dispatched sailors in every available pinnace and steam tug to join in the search and rescue efforts as well as the retrieval of those who had not survived. Retrieval work was no easy task, as the Sardinia continued to burn from stem to stern for some time. The salvage vessel Hermes stood by but could not approach. For those with loved ones on the Sardinia, it was a difficult and confusing time. Initially, the ship that was lost was reported to be the P&O line of the same name, before it was clarified that it was the Papiani-Ellerman line ship that had burned so tragically. Then there was confusion over who all had been on the ship, as well as who had been rescued. The loss of the engine crew and Captain Littler, as well as Chief Officer Frew, who had aided the captain until the end, was a certainty. But the passenger list was much less certain than the crew list. As people were brought to shore, there was no effort to check them against a list of passengers. There was too little time, and most of them were rushed into medical care instead. Combining that with the fact that not all of the remains were found, it made it difficult to tell who had been saved and who had not been for some time. At the coroner's inquest, a finding of drowned was found in every case, even when the remains were badly damaged by the flames. It seemed like a moot point in the face of the horror that had rocked the city. As the dust settled, it was found that 16 members of the crew, 2 of the European passengers, and 65 of the pilgrims had been lost, making the final count of those lost in the disaster 83. Many of the people who had been lost were women and children. The newspapers reported that one of the people who had been hospitalized in the civil hospital was a very young child who was not satisfied no matter whose care it was in. One of the nurses, thinking that maybe it would be more comfortable in the care of some of the other passengers who had been hospitalized, began to wander around the hospital hoping to find someone that could take care of the child. On approaching one group of the people who had been on pilgrimage, the child threw itself into the arms of a man. It was found that the man was the child's father. The father had lost his wife and his other 5 children in the flames, and had assumed that this child had also been lost. He was described in a frenzy of joy, his tears falling on the child's face as they embraced. There was a huge outpouring of support for the survivors. The Malta Chronicle opened up a relief fund and was immediately flooded with donations. Meanwhile, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, was deeply troubled to hear that the pilgrims did not in general have any representatives or family in Malta. The Duke and Duchess of Connaught visited the hospital where the injured were recovering to offer their sympathy and support, donated £100 to the relief fund, and promised to pay for the burial of all of the pilgrims who had been lost so far from their families and friends. It was a generous gesture that was met with much gratitude. The funeral and burial rites for the pilgrims were performed by the Ottoman consul and the Ottoman resident chaplain. Captain Littler's remains were recovered, but they were described as bearing many signs of the explosive flames that had engulfed him. They were returned to his home in Birkenhead, where a large crowd gathered to bury the man who was widely recognized as a hero. Stewardess Gilmore would also get a hero's treatment for her efforts to save passengers. The Committee of Lloyds bestowed her with a silver medal to recognize her life-saving efforts. It was the first time that Lloyd's Medal for saving life at sea had ever been given to a woman. In the end, it was never completely explained how a cargo that should not have been so explosive seemed to explode. The shipping company insisted that none of their cargo needed special care or permits to transport. They were offended by the idea that they would transport combustibles such as gunpowder on any of their ships, and assured the public that they did not. The cargo of oil was only a small amount, and only stored where the fire originated. The violence of the fire would never be answered. As one passenger put it, quote, "Well, I have seen fires on board ships before, but never seen a fire as I've seen through today. There was no time for anything." For more information, please see the Straits Times from December 19th, 1908, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.